Saadadeen,
Sulaiman.
how was your week?
This week I've been reading George Bush's memoirs. He lays out his memoirs as 14 chapters that are the 14 most important decisions he's made in his life. And one thing that stuck out to me is a line from his first chapter, which is about his decision to quit drinking at 40 years old. He says the decision to quit drinking was one of the most difficult decisions he's ever made in his life. But without making that decision, he wouldn't have been able to make subsequent decisions later in life. And that made me think about the quote by Einstein about madness. Einstein defines madness as doing the same thing and expecting different results. So that made me think about myself and how I can bridge that gap between the me today versus the better me tomorrow. And
Mm.
one of my vices, as you probably know, is YouTube. So I use YouTube for like 90% of the information I consume. And one thing I've tried to implement this week and is not using technology for at least 2 days of a week. And it's something I would definitely recommend. So far it's allowed me to see how much of a major player technology is in my life and how refreshing it is to not use technology and not be reliant upon it. So that's what my week's been looking like, man. What about yourself?
That's a really interesting week you've had. I definitely feel like there's a correlation for me personally between the more I use technology and the less productive I am
Mm,
as an individual. And just like you've been regulating your technology consumption, this week I've tried to regulate my food consumption or at
mm,
least keep a track of it. So this week I started a food journal. So so essentially what it's enabled me to do is keep a track on all of the different food and drink that I've consumed this week. Um, and ultimately it's been really valuable because I feel like it's helped me identify my eating habits and my consumption patterns. Um, and now that I have all of this data, I'm able to correct any imbalances in my diet, and I'm able to make changes where necessary. Um, and there's that famous saying, what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. So I'm going to try my best to keep tracking my food habits in this food journal.
mm.
Um, yeah, so shall we get into this reflection for
Let's
Esrom's
go, man.
episode?
So yeah, we're
Let's
reflecting on
go.
Esrom's episode. What were your thoughts?
What were my thoughts? So whilst rewatching Esrom's episode, there were so many different themes that caught my attention. There was the stuff to do with the risks of comparing yourself to others. There was the stuff to do with the dangers of ego and the positive impact of teachers on students, etc. But the theme that I want to discuss with you today is on London culture,
Mm,
particularly inner city London culture.
mm.
Um, during our conversation with Esrom, there was one particular segment where this theme really shined through.
Like especially like Mufti Day when you get to wear your clothes.
Yeah.
I just remember like you're like, oh, what am I gonna wear? I need to
Yeah.
wear something. Yeah, like
You
What,
prepared the
what
day
was,
before.
what was
yeah,
the
you wear
thing?
the day before.
What was
like,
the thing in our year? 'Cause I remember it was G Star raw jeans and a
Yeah.
Ralphie. It,
yeah,
like,
rough, yeah,
yeah,
and it
and-
didn't matter. I remember like if you find something that was cheap, innit, yeah, like a designer brand that was cheap, it don't matter what size it is. Bro,
What
you
colour,
can make
what
shit,
size?
yeah, it does not matter.
As long as the horse is
Yeah.
is there, it's showing.
Whether it's in the way we dress, like your reference to the Polo Ralph Lauren t-shirts, whether it's in the way we walk, whether it's in the way we speak, the way we interact in public, etc. I don't think anyone would argue with the fact that there's a very distinct inner city London culture. The culture has very strong African and Caribbean roots, and in recent years it has evolved to be influenced by Somali, North African, Arab, and Asian culture as well, reflecting the changing social makeup of the city. Um, but aside from London culture changing, the culture has also grown in influence. Um, so this week I was reading Afua Hirsch's book British, and in her book she makes the point that London subculture, especially through language and especially through music, has grown exponentially in the last few years. And it's grown so much that it's shaped the identities and the youth culture in communities across the UK and across the world. So yeah, the way inner city London culture has changed and the way that it's expanded to influence so many people is something that I find really fascinating. Because I know that London definitely has a very strong like a noticeable place in my heart and in my identity. So the question I have for you, Saadadeen, is when I ask you to think of London, what image do you paint in your head?
London for me is a huge part of my identity, and it's something I feel like it's a blessing to live and to grow up in London. I think, like you said, growing up in London is almost like it's the world in one city, and for me that means having a wealth of cultural understanding and knowledge, whether it's like your neighbor being from one part of the world and a neighbor on the other side being from a completely different part of the world. It means that you can understand humans and human behavior and different cultures as just a part of growing up in London. And I think for me that's been a huge luxury and something I don't take for granted. And it's something you realize as well when you leave London. So a lot of Londoners that might be listening to this, as soon as you leave London, you realize how much of a Londoner you are, how much of the things about your quirks and personalities are to do with growing up in London. Images that come to my mind are like Shepherd's Bush Market, going shopping with my mum and just having to lug around that shopping trolley. And I also think about things like the politics of going to school on the bus and where you sit means about your social standing, whether that's on the back, on the top deck, or right at the front, or and on the bottom deck, and the politics of going on the London Tube, not making any eye contact, and just staring at the floor or going on your phone. And so for me, London is like a whole plethora of things, but it's definitely a huge part of my identity. And definitely, the more I grow, the more I realize how much being a Londoner has shaped who I am today.
Nah, man, your thoughts definitely resonate with me, man. It's such an amazing place to grow up. But yeah, without further ado,
Yeah.
Saadadeen, man, what was your reflection on our conversation with Esrom?
So my conversation with my reflections on our conversation with Esrom kind of, for me, came about after hearing this.
Really and truly, when you look at that, it's like, are you doing it for you or are you doing it for people? Because like, if you're doing it for yourself, then why does the comparison matter? You know what I mean? If you're content with yourself and what your journey is and what your plan is, then what does it matter if So Said is at this level in his career and you're just here at the moment? Because it doesn't matter at the end of the day if you're content with your own plan and your own journey. But I think when you're young, like you care about those things. You care about what people say, like, there's this person here that's doing this, and you're not in the talk, so you're like, I need to be in the talk, or like, you know what I mean?
That's
so
what it was.
What this made me think about is having honest conversations with ourselves about the motivations that lie behind our actions. And this kind of conversations that we have with ourselves is not an easy one. It requires a lot of honesty, a lot of vulnerability, and it's something that made me think about starting after work with you, Sulaiman, and the kind of conversations and thoughts that we had. Intention for us was a huge factor in terms of why we're starting this up, and I think as it should be. After Work is a project that is very public. It's on the internet, and I know it's not just me and you, but a lot of people who have thoughts about starting a project online think about, like, why am I doing this? Am I doing this just for attention? Am I just doing it because it's a trend? And I think these are valid thoughts, and I think for us, the way we try to deal with those thoughts is to have honest conversations with each other about what our intentions are and where they lie. And one thing I think was a huge factor in propelling After Work to being a real life project is both of our intentions aligning. And having said that, I would say that intention is not something that you just deal with and move on. It's something that you and I have continued to check in on. And intention checking and checking our motivations is something that I feel like is a journey, and it's not just a decision you make one off. For us, that means having conversations every now and then, scheduling meetings where we talk about After Work, and what it's looking like and where we want it to be. So my conversation based on that theme of intentions and motivations that underlie our actions is, Sulaiman, what method do you have for identifying the intentions that lie behind your actions?
Mm. That's a really interesting question, and it's a really important topic. Like you said, it's like intentions was something that me and you both considered before we started this podcast. And intentions are really important for me. My values are grounded in my faith, and in my religion, actions are fundamentally judged by your intentions. So checking intentions and reflecting and renewing intentions are acts that I try to do as frequently as possible. In terms of the best way for me to check my intentions and the method in which I check my intentions, I'd say number one, the first thing I do is I take a step back. I take a step back away from the public. I take a step back from the influence of external factors. I try to take a step back from everything. And then when I'm alone, when I'm by myself, just me, myself and my mind, number two, I try to ask the following questions. Like, so what are your values? What are your ethics? And do your current actions or your potential actions align with those values and ethics? And like you said, it's so important to be honest with yourself when you're checking your intentions, because it's very easy to convince yourself in any given situation that you're doing the right thing. I feel like human beings just have that skill of justifying nearly everything. But ultimately, if you do lie to yourself, even if it's just a white lie, you're only prolonging an inevitable sense of frustration, because your actions at the end of the day will be not aligned to your values. So yeah, for me, in summary, the method I kind of adopt for checking my intentions is, number one, I try to have a concrete understanding of my values, and number two, I question myself in isolation about whether those values align with my actions and vice versa.
No, that's very insightful. So here's good friend and regular listener Zachariah sharing his insights into our conversation with Esrom.
I really enjoyed the episode. I think you guys touched on a lot of interesting points, had me cracking up the entire way through. I think it's mad how similar like our secondary school experiences really are. Everyone had their G-Star, Ralph days. Comparison is the thief of joy. I think that's a great quotable from Saadadeen. I'm probably going to steal that. But I think that's something a lot of us can relate to. I think personally, as I've matured, I try to compare myself less and less, trust my own path in life. But I think, just as Sulaiman said, we're all guilty of it. We all, status seek sometimes to an extent, whether it's university degrees, sports, whatever it may be. But what I want to hear a little bit more about is one of the last things you guys spoke about, which is embracing change. And, how do you strike a balance between embracing change, finding the time for your hobbies or, something creative that you might want to do, and building your career, progressing with education. How have you guys been able to strike that balance with the podcast?
So next week, we will be reflecting on our conversation with Mobeen. If you had any thoughts for yourself about that conversation and that episode, please feel free to get in contact with us. And again, I hope everyone is well and in the best of health. See you next week.